strength, and faith. Listen in as we explore how God's love and grace can inspire and motivate us to overcome life's challenges and light the path forward.
Hello, Pathfinders. How are y'all? How is it going? What are you up to? Y'all know I got to take my glasses off. It's a little glare, but don't let that distract you. Thank you so much for joining Light the Path podcast again. And if you're new here, welcome. We're so glad you're here. I have another wonderful episode for you. Do not be dismayed because I want you to be notified every time there is a new episode. So hit the subscribe button right now so that way every time it will come up. Now, it won't be a lot. So don't feel like you're going to get bombarded with bing, 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 bing. It won't be like that. It will be just enough to satisfy your curiosity about Light the Path and all the great things that are going on over here and all the wonderful guests. Today is not a solo episode. It is a guest today. And like every other episode, you are going to thoroughly enjoy this. Today, I have writer, author, Ruth Buchanan here on the show. Y'all help me welcome Ruth to Light the Path podcast.
Hi, Deborah. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much. And what I want to talk about today, Pathfinders, let me put my glasses back on. I would be remiss not to tell you the title of this podcast. This one is going to be Grace in New Friendships, Making Connections as Adults.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, this is a sticky one. Ruth, thank you so much for joining in. Let the Pathfinders know all about you. Well, share what you will with them about who you are.
Sure. Thank you, Deborah. I am a writer and I'm also a person of faith. And so those two things work together and both of them will be part of what I talk about today. But within the last 5 years, I also moved. And when I moved, I lost a social network and a church community that I'd been embedded in for about 30 years. And then I also practice a very solitary craft, which is writing. So figuring out, like Deborah talked about, how do I make friends at this point in my life when I don't leave the house a lot, when I have limited time and energy, when I'm not working, but I'm not really going a lot of places, that all has been really challenging. And so over the last 5 years, I've had to put in some practice, some skills and some other things in order to figure that out. But that bit of background, I think, is going to give you some context for what we talk about today. I love to travel. I just got back from a trip. I love people. I do have friends. We'll talk about that. But but I just think over the last 5 years, I think a lot of us have been on a journey of change, whether it's something we've chosen for ourselves or whether, some have change thrust upon them. And so if that's you, we know how that feels, right?
Yes. And okay, so I have to give a little back context on how this all happened. So during a holiday season, of course, there's always socials and gatherings, etc. So one of my friends, Rosalind, invited me to her house for a holiday party, which I met Ruth at. This is my first time meeting Ruth, and I felt like we sat on the couch. We were fast friends. We were saying all these things. And so when I left there, in my mind, I said, you know what? I need to have Ruth on the podcast to talk about making friends as adults. Like, how do we do this? How do we even get in the space to do it? Are we even open to it? And so because that was my first time meeting you, I was sort of like, because we started out strong during the evening, and then it's sort of like, other people came. And
yes. We got separated.
We got separated. There was another Ruth in the building too. So it was like, okay. So we were, mingling around as such. It was no problem. But I had the idea, but I did go back to her and say, hey, for whatever reason. So then months later, I get with Rosalind and I'm like, hey, can you ask Ruth number one because she arrived first that I would like her information. So I'm running this idea through our mutual friend. Mm-hmm. And so it was a beautiful thing and we got connected. And so here we are today. But what happened in between that time, Mel Robbins put out a podcast episode about making new friends. So that just, Holy Spirit gave me a little tap like, see, you had a good idea. Someone else did the idea, but there's still more context
Yes.
because Ruth has a very special situation that some of us may not be able to understand because we have been in sort of these spaces already. So 3 points that Mel brought out in her podcast were these. She said these are sort of like pillars to making new friends. The close proximity, the time of life, and then the similar energy. So Ruth, I want to ask you, as an adult, what have you found to be the biggest hurdle in forming new friendships?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, Deborah. And those 3 pillars, I think those are kind of truisms. It is easier to make friends when you're in proximity, when you're in similar stages of life, and when you have similar energies. However, sometimes there are situations where one or the other of those things are beyond your control to match. For example, this is what Deborah and I talked about when we met, is I am 46 as of the time of this recording. I never married. I've never had children. And so making friends as a single woman, as all your friends and all your peers are going through the stages of marriage and children and family life, that's been challenging, right? And Mel even mentioned in her podcast a couple of times, she did seem to be basing that pillar on you're going through the same things at the same time. Your kids are all in elementary school together. You meet at soccer practices. You meet at swim practices. You meet maybe she didn't mention church, but for my context, your kids are all in vacation Bible school together. And therefore you're all helping and things like that. And so for me, because I've been somewhat out of step with my peers through the last few decades, I've had to figure out what does it look like for me to make friends if I don't have a similar life context to most of the women who are in my same age. I wouldn't even say stage of life. I would say similar ages. And so I would say I agreed with her pillars, but I would say she didn't leave a lot for those of us who are in a different situation or who are in a special situation in some of those areas.
I definitely agree because I have had children. I have been married. And it's not that I don't have the kids anymore. They're just grown, right? They're in their 20s. They're grown. They're living their lives. And so now, and I'm also divorced. So I'm single. I'm not a single. Am I a single mom or not? Anyway, that's another podcast. My kids are 27 and 26. I'm a grandma. So some of my peers who are 45, their kids are in maybe middle school. They're going to soccer practice. They're doing the birthday parties. And can I be honest? I don't want to go to Chuck E. Cheese.
Right?
I've been one time with my grands, and I believe I got sick from there. But so my situation is also a unique situation because I did have children younger. I was married at a younger age. So now it's like I moved here 3 years ago. So I was a little bit behind you, Ruth. You were already getting here, getting situated. It was also a hurdle for me to figure out how do I make connections. And so for me, the pillar that most stuck with me for Mel was the similar energies, people that are sort of doing the things that I like to do. I like gardening. So I get with a garden group. You know what I mean? I like to eat. So I get with different food groups. So like you said, church. And I think church is probably, for me, the best place because we're all sort of going in the same direction, right? We thought that this particular place or space is, a good place to be. So those were some of the things that I have had challenges with because I'm not doing the birthday parties. I mean, I will get the kid a gift, but I'm drawing a line at you.
And I found at different phases in my life, I had more or less energy to do those sorts of things. When I was living in Florida and maybe 10 or 15 years younger, I had a good friend who had children who did lacrosse, who did swimming. And I would show up at the game, maybe for the second half, and then we would go out together after. And I really enjoyed that rhythm for a season. But like you said, at this point, I don't want to go to Chuck E. Cheese. It's like, so I found when I moved here, I thought I had a friend who said, well, we're doing swim meets. Do you want to come meet us at the swim meet and hang out there? And I just said, no, let's find another time.
Yes, definitely. So how do you navigate the vulnerability of just putting yourself out there to make the new connections? Like, we're in the second phase of life almost.
Yes. And I love that you asked that question, because vulnerability, you get to decide how vulnerable you want to be and in what spaces vulnerability is safe, right? And so when I think about that question, I actually create, when I'm thinking about making a new friend, when I'm feeling good about a new connection, I don't immediately become super vulnerable and say, let's see how this goes. Is she a safe person? Is she someone I want to trust? So vulnerability with no commitment in the relationship and with no reciprocity and with no feeling of mutual trust is way riskier than it needs to be. Vulnerability is always a risk, but vulnerability with someone who has proven themselves trustworthy is less of a risk. And so what I have done as I've navigated a new environment is I've put into place almost steps to figure out, do I want to move forward in trust with this person? And one of the things that really clicked in for me a few years ago is, in romantic relationships in our culture, there really is the expectation of clarity in a way we don't put on most other relationships. I expect clarity if I'm attracted to men. So if I'm meeting with a man regularly and we meet a couple weeks in a row and it goes great, eventually I'm going to ask, what are we? Is
Yes.
this going anywhere? And
Right.
most of us in friendships want to ask that. If we start thinking about someone as a friend, we want to know, does she also think about me as a friend? Does she
Mhm.
also trust me? Does she also want to keep meeting up? Or is she just saying yes because it's polite? Or, here in the South, especially, there's the idea of reciprocity as politeness. And so sometimes we're wondering, does this person feel the same way as I do about the relationship? Now, in romance, there's the expectation that we're going to define the relationship or have a DTR. I would love to put that same type of structure around friendships, which is what I do. So when I moved here in January of 2021, and I made some mistakes. Do we have a minute for me to tell you about a few of the
Yes, I
mistakes
want
that
to
I made?
hear, because I might have fallen into some of these too. Go ahead.
Maybe. So I left Florida in January of 2021, and I didn't expect to settle in this area. I expected to be here for a year or less because I had gotten a new job in March 2020, right as everything was kind of coming unraveled around the pandemic. And I had been originally intending to move to a bigger city, but the pandemic happened and everything got disrupted. And so I had a family member who had a home in this area who said, why don't you live there temporarily while you look for housing in the city? I said, great. And so when I first moved here, I thought, I'm not going to stay here very long. It was super painful to leave my 30-year context in Florida. And I thought, I don't know if I want to go through all of that again. So I'll just kind of skim the surface while I'm here. I won't make a lot of friends. I had one friend from college who lived in the area, and she introduced me to someone else. And I thought, that's it. That's all I need. But then when I realized I was going to stay here, then I thought, I've already been here a year and I don't have any friends. And I have to actually start digging in. And that's when I realized I made a big mistake. And the life lesson I learned from that is, no matter how long you think you're going to be in a context, you don't know how long God has in store. Scripture says that we make our plans, but God orders our steps. And so I really lived that out. And I thought, never again will I intentionally hold back from connecting with people, thinking I know best and thinking I can protect myself. So about a year into living here, I started thinking I need friends, because my two friends I knew went on vacation at the same time. That's really what did it. And I was like, I can't live like this. I don't have any friends. I actually have to make more friends. And so what I do now is I put structure around friendship the way many people put structure around dating or romantic relationships. And so if I meet someone and a connection sparks. Like when we met Deborah, there was some kind of spark. There was a connection. We sat and talked. We did lose track of each other because there were so many people there in multiple rooms and a lot happening. But I remember when we first talked, we went small talk to deep talk pretty quickly. And there was, like Mel talked about in her podcast, there was an energy there. In her podcast episode, though, she didn't talk about what to actually do when you sense that energy, how to tell, does that person sense it back? Because we both know sometimes someone feels like they're vibing with you and you're not. It's like, have you ever been approached in a store and you're like, leave me alone, I'm trying to buy bananas? Like,
right. Not right now.
yeah, not right now. And so what I do when there's that connection or there's that spark, I extend an offer, whether in that moment or whether later. I circle back and say, hey, would you want to take a walk with me sometime? Would you want to have coffee sometime? I make it kind of low key. And it does sound a lot like dating, right? I don't go 0 to night out. I'll be like, let's take a walk. Let's get a coffee and see how that goes. So I extend an offer, but then I wait. Even if I had a great time, and even if I think the friends seem to have a great time, if I've extended an offer, usually I wait to see, is there anything mutual? Like if I'm always texting her and she's texting me back, but she's never initiating anything, that shows something.
Yeah.
And if I am always bearing the burden of let's get together, let's communicate, and the other person isn't picking up the burden at any point, that doesn't mean I'll never be friends with them, but I want to know that early on.
Yeah.
Is there going to be a mutual, is there mutual interest? Is there a mutual sharing of burdens and communicating and connecting? And I let that period go on for a little while. I wait to see, okay, she invited me out. I invited her out. I don't keep like a little one-to-one, like, well, it's her turn. But I do kind of look at how that balances out. And during that time, I watch for red flags. And I note green flags. I've actually made a list of the types of friends that I would like to have at this phase in my life. And I've made a list of friendship values. Because in the past, I did not do that. And because I love communication and I love attention, whoever was communicating the most with me or whoever responded back the most quickly, I felt like we were becoming good friends. She always texts me back. She's always free when I want to go out. And I got involved sometimes in friendships where the other person didn't have certain character qualities. And I should have noticed that, but I didn't, because I was so excited to have someone excited to connect with me. Mm-hmm. And so during that period, it took me 46 years to figure out, just like you would with a partner, you would sit and think, what are some values and what are some things that I look for in friendships? And so trustworthiness is a big one. Someone who mutually invests in the relationship is a big one. Yeah. Someone who doesn't gossip to me about other people is a big one. If you're gossiping to me about other people, I know you're going to gossip about me. So during that time when I'm looking for mutuality, I'm also evaluating the nature of our interactions. It doesn't mean that if someone shows a red flag, I'm going to drop them. It just means I'm going to say, okay, she has a tendency toward gossip. I won't trust her with certain things at this point. And so I look for red flags, I look for green flags, and I look to see if this person aligns with the values that I hold at this point in my life. And then when there's no set time for that. Mel mentioned in the podcast, give it a year when you're lonely, like give it a year. Relationships take time to develop. But I would say if you're getting together with someone once a week for a year, that's very different from every 3 weeks or, once a quarter, depending on how busy people are. So I don't think there's any set period of time for this, but when I have a good feeling about a friendship, I've seen mutuality, I've been around them enough to evaluate how they treat me, how they treat other people, then I actually do define the relationship. If I'm going to consider someone a good friend, usually we come to a point, and the friends I have here will tell you this happened with them, where I say, hey, we've been hanging out for a couple of months and I've really enjoyed it. And because I'm a direct and straightforward person, I do this face to face when we're hanging out. And I'll say, hey, I have loved spending time with you over the last couple of months. And I really would like to move forward. And I think we could be really good friends if we gave it a chance. Is that something you'd be interested in? Would you be interested in is that the way you're thinking about our friendship? And then we have a talk about it. And someone asked me recently, I was talking with a friend this weekend when we were traveling, and the question came up, like, has anyone ever said no to that? Like, it hasn't, because I've gone through all these steps to get there. So we started by talking about vulnerability. And the reason I've gone through this whole thing is to show by the time we get to that vulnerable question, I think we could be really good friends. And here's what that would mean to me. It would mean intentionally hanging out, making time for each other. Yeah. It would mean bearing each other's burdens, keeping each other's confidence, encouraging each other, and confronting each other as needed if we see the other one going off the rails. That's what good friendship looks like to me. If that's something you're interested in, we could talk about what that would look like for us. If that's something you don't have the bandwidth for right now, I'm fine with I love the way we're hanging out now, but I want you to know that I'm starting to think about you as a good friend, because I found in women's friendships, especially, which is the only type I've really experienced on a deep level, the real strife comes in when one woman is out of alignment. Like one woman thinks you're really close and you're like, I don't want to go to Europe with you. We're not really like that.
Yeah.
And so that's where a lot of the disappointment and the hurt feelings and the expectations versus reality friction could come in. And so using this kind of process, this more structured process to determine who are my friends versus who are people I hang out with because we both have time, has really given me spaces where I know I can be open and vulnerable because there's safety and there's commitment in the relationship.
This is very good, because as I'm thinking about this and listening to you speak, I don't think I've ever asked anyone to be my friend, because of some of the things that Mel was talking about. Our kids were doing the same thing. So we were in the same spaces. We're waiting on my daughter ran track. So we're waiting for a 10-second race for 2 hours. So we're, saying whatever. And like you mentioned earlier, like, you said that, we went from small talk to, really talking. And I just don't like small talk. So it's like either I'm going to say something that is deep, which sometimes that will also draw, that will filter out people. So you're like, okay, we all know it's hot out here. Okay. So how many times we say, oh, yeah, it's hot out here. If you start saying that kind of stuff, I'm going to get them moving away from you. So, so I know how to disconnect, but the connection part that you were talking about, I guess I've really never made that true connection. Like, hey, we're going to be friends. I just let it happen by nutrition. I'm like, okay, so they fall off. I'm like, oh, okay, no problem. I just let it go.
Them.
Those who stay, let them. Those who stay, I just, continue the process. And like you said, in my mind, I do believe that there's a level of confidence, right? Mm-hmm. Once, you say, okay, we've had these encounters, we've had shared things, then now I'm ready to be vulnerable. So what role does grace play in maintaining friendships as an adult, especially when life gets busy? Because, other parents, not me, have other stuff going on. And how do we extend grace?
That's a good question, because life gets busy, as you mentioned, but it also gets messy. Our friends that we make, especially when I made some of my friends when I was younger, and we're still friends this whole time. I went on a trip this weekend with 2 friends. We've known each other 20 years or more. And I'm not referencing them here when I say this, but the age that we're all in now, our mid to late 40s, we're entering the era where marriages are falling apart. The bigger the kids, the bigger the problems. And so really serious stuff is coming up with us and with people in our friend group, serious financial woes and things like that. And friendship cannot continue the exact same way when situations change dramatically for one party or the other. And so I think one way that grace factors into friendships is to be flexible with our expectations of people through different phases in life. When we were in our 20s and we were working jobs that were maybe a little more low key, and some of us didn't have children, and some of us didn't have the burden of aging parents or other things on our plate, it was easier to say, hang out a few times a week. And if we think we should still be doing this now because that's what friendship looks like, most people in our phase cannot hang out 3 nights a week. We cannot drop everything and go on vacations the way we used to when we were younger. And so being flexible with our expectations of others through different phases in life. It would be horrible to lose a friendship because the other friend was going through something and we thought, well, she doesn't have time for me anymore, and we dropped them. So I think moving when a friend pulls back, what I try to do now is move toward that with curiosity. And I learned that through trial and error. I have made mistakes, even in the last few years with this. I had a very good friend who I felt was kind of leaving the relationship. It was weird. We had never had any conflict, not any big conflict. We love to bicker, but we had never had any big conflict. And then I felt like she really wasn't answering my messages. We hadn't seen each other in a long time, and she didn't seem to be missing that. And I thought maybe that friendship has just run its course. That happens sometimes. Come to find out later, she was going through something really big that if I had asked, are you okay? But I never asked that. I never moved toward it with curiosity. I assumed I knew what that silence meant, and I was wrong. I almost lost that friendship. So I would say being flexible in our expectations is a way to show grace, and moving toward changes in the energy in the friendship with curiosity rather than deciding we know what that means is a huge way to show grace. Starting with, has everything been okay? Because you've been pretty quiet lately, rather than jumping like I did to the assumption that you've been pretty quiet lately. Do you hate me now? Or have you found a new friend? Which I would be happy for. We don't all have to be the only person's only friend. So I have a friend recently who just entered a new relationship. And because of that, a lot of her time is bound up in that new relationship. I could either be jealous about that, or I could say, this is a phase in our friendship. If I were in a new relationship, I would probably be all bound up in that for a while as well. And so having grace with each other, I would also say having grace with each other's mistakes and bad choices. I have an acquaintance who's also a writer. Her name is Heather Thompson Day. She wrote a book called I'll See You Tomorrow, and it is about relationships. But she said something in it I found so profound that I've carried it with me. I've applied it to relationships. I've applied it in other areas of my life. She said, an incident, as hurtful as it may be, an incident can be forgiven. A pattern must be broken. We talked earlier about evaluating red and green flags. Everyone can have a bad day. Everyone can be snippy. Everyone can make a mistake and slip up. And I would hate to cut someone off over an incident that could be forgiven. Some incidents are too big. If my neighbor murdered my other neighbor, I wouldn't say that's not a pattern, right? So some things are big and we need to take strong action, but other things are a moment and we need to ask, is this an incident that I can forgive? But if it becomes a pattern, then we have to say, how can we break that pattern? And so grace looks like forgiving someone who makes a mistake, who, as hurtful as it may be, yes, we need to address it. We need to have a conversation about it. But what I'm seeing, in some of the younger generation, there's a very good conversation happening about red flags and about toxicity and cutting people off if they are unrepentantly abusive or damaging. I think that's very good. I'm Gen X, so my generation didn't really get a lot of that. It was just like, you take it. It's like, this is it, deal with it. But if that's carried too far, we cut people off over moments, and that's damaging to friendship as well. So grace looks like when we're hurt by someone, when we feel abandoned, or we feel like they betrayed a confidence, or we feel like they were sarcastic with us when we were hurting. Grace looks like initiating a conversation about that, although it's awkward, rather than just saying, well, I guess she's toxic, and ghosting the friendship. And then if we have a conversation about it and the other person says, I'm so sorry, I didn't intend to do that, I will not do that again. Then if they do it again, then we can say, now it's looking like a pattern and she's not going to change. Maybe I reevaluate my participation in this friendship. But I think grace looks like starting with, this is an incident, and what would forgiveness and love look like? And then if it's a pattern, asking, what does love look like in addressing this pattern?
That's so good. I like that, because that brings it more intentional. You're really trying to get down to the intent of what's going on, opposed to, like you said, I would look at it like, what's wrong with me? Why you don't want to be friends with me? And it's really not even about us sometimes. It's about the other person. So I love the way that you put that, to extend grace in that way, because we all need that, because we could be on the other side of the friendship coin. And I'm like going through everything, right? And trying to fight through it and don't even have time to maybe respond back to a text. So I love the way that you put that. What advice would you give to someone feeling isolated and unsure about making new friends as they get older?
I would start by saying, I want to affirm you. It is harder now. When we were kids, we had pretty limited access to friends, because especially when we were kids, there was no internet. I mean, the phone had a curly cord and we had to ask permission to call our friends. And, it was more limiting, but in a way, the limited scope ensured face-to-face connection with people in a way our culture today does not. So with the rise of online and digital communications, as beneficial as that can be in some ways, it really creates a new landscape for friendship that's kind of reshaped how we connect to each other. Some people will spend more time connecting with online out-of-town friends daily than they do connecting with people in their own physical context. I don't know. I did recently move to a neighborhood, so that's part of it, but I don't know my neighbors very well. And I'm very friendly. When I moved in, I went and knocked on the next door neighbor's door and tried to introduce myself and, was trying to meet people. They didn't seem very interested in that. And that's okay. I'm not for everybody, but I'm the type who I want to know my neighbors. I want to know your name before there's a crisis. That's when people we just had a hurricane at the end of September. That's when some people met their neighbors for the first time. I don't want it to be that way. But I think part of what has shaped our culture in this way is those people who seem too busy to really connect with the people around them on a daily basis. It's not because they're not connecting anywhere, but they may be finding their meaningful connections elsewhere than in the physical space where they're living. And there is some benefit to that for sure, but it has changed the way we interact with the people around us for sure. So I think we need to acknowledge that it's not just because we're older, quote unquote. It's because the relational pattern has shifted globally and maybe our approach hasn't shifted as a result. So anytime something shifts, we need to shift our response to it. If I'm driving and it's sunny and then it starts raining, I'm going to shift my approach to driving as a result of the rain. When I first wanted to get a job in 1990, whatever it was, I physically went and asked for an application. I filled it out with a pen. I turned it in, and then I physically went back and asked the manager, has anyone looked at my application yet? That's not how people apply for jobs anymore. And if I were still doing that, I would be frustrated and not getting a job. So I think acknowledging something has changed in the way we interact with people and asking, how should I shift my approach as a result? I think that's going to get us started rather than just saying, I'm turning in my application at the counter. I don't know why no one's calling me back, and being frustrated that what we're doing isn't working. So I do want to acknowledge it is harder and acknowledge there's reasons why, and asking, okay, should I take a new approach? Should I try something new? And figuring out what works for you and your personality. I was laughing, Deborah, when I listened to Mel's podcast, because at the end she was giving advice on how to make connections. She started with loose social connections, like at the coffee shop. She's like, go around and ask people's names. And I'm like, this is extrovert behavior. I would do all this stuff she's mentioning, but I have introverted family members and friends who would rather fall through an open manhole cover than go around asking everybody's name. So I think it's worth it, not just to say what works for Mel Robbins or what works for Ruth Buchanan or what works for Deborah, but asking, okay, what's the principle underneath that? And how would that work for me?
I think that's really good.
And then practice it. All skills require practice.
Yes.
So I wrote a book a couple of years ago. You can see it on the shelf behind me, called Socially Awkward. And it's about how to have hard conversations about tough topics. I had to practice how to do that because I didn't grow up talking about hard and awkward things. It was like, if these topics came up, maybe politics or maybe sexual abuse or body image and weight gain or death, it was like, oh, change the subject. That's too hard to talk about. So I arrived in midlife feeling like I don't really know how to talk about these things. So I had to figure out how to do it. And then I had to practice it. Any skill requires practice. Those musicians that you love, they did not just fall from the sky knowing how to play those instruments, right? They practiced it in private and then they look proficient in public. And so if you are trying to make new social connections and make new friends and the first few attempts don't go well, don't think, well, I guess I'm not good at this. I guess I'll never make a friend. I guess I'm a loser. Is asking, okay, that person didn't match my energy, or that person wasn't interested in moving forward. But I'm practicing new skills. And so that wasn't a loss, because if you want to be friends with someone and they don't really get you, or like it just doesn't seem to be on their radar, I've put other people through this friendship test that I described earlier, and it hasn't gone beyond like 0.2 or 0.3 because they just don't seem interested. And that's what happens sometimes. And so I would say if you make a couple of attempts and they're not reciprocated, don't give up, because these things require practice, and they also require intentionality, and they also have a variable that you can't control in them, which is the other person's response. And you can't control that. That's not on you. And I have a friend who's kind of lonely and is living in a more isolated type life. And I encouraged this friend, why don't you invite some people over? This person can't really get out much physically. I said, why don't you invite some people over to hang out with you? She made a few attempts, and the person, I'm busy, I can't come over, and then didn't make any attempts after that because she said it didn't work. And that's where consistency is really going to pay off. Just like trying to get a job when you were young, if you applied a couple of places and they didn't call you back, that doesn't mean you're never going to get a job. It just means I need to call some other places, apply some other places. Just don't give up. If friendship matters to you, if relationships matter to you, if you want a different result, start practicing these principles and then don't give up.
So good. So many great points. And on your Instagram bio, it says, it says you're the writer's best friend. So if you want to meet and become an acquaintance first, okay, because there's a process. We're acquaintance first. Acquaintance with Ruth Buchanan. Let them know how to connect with you on social media.
Sure. Right now, I am on Instagram and Threads at Ruth M. Buchanan, Buchanan. And I am on there pretty regularly. And I do love connecting with writers because that's part of my job. I'm a writer, and I also provide services to other writers, but I also am many other things. So I'm a reader and a runner and a traveler and a girl's girl. And so don't feel like, oh, Ruth only wants to connect with writers. I definitely love writers, but I love everybody.
Ruth, thank you so much for being here on Light the Path. Pathfinders, sharing your experiences is not only empowering, it can help light the path.
Yes, thank you so much.